Is it fair to punish a pilot when his car is on the verge of technical collapse? What would you do if your brakes fail in full race? Today we are going to uncover everything that happened with Lewis Hamilton and its controversial sanction in the Singapore 2025 GP, where new FIA data has generated more questions than answers. Stay, because what you are going to discover is not what was said in the official transmission. The first training sessions already gave worrying signs. The engineers reported unusually high temperatures on the front brakes, and especially on the left disc. Hamilton, on the other hand, constantly adjusted his driving style. He modified braking points, used lift and coast techniques, and constantly communicated with the wall to try to keep under control a situation that deteriorated around after. In this context of mechanical tension and sports pressure, the British managed to stay within the top 10 for a good part of the race. His rhythm, although diminished by conservative adjustments in brake management, remained competitive, but the margin of error was minimal. In Marina Bay, if you lose 2% performance, you lose positions. If you lose 10%, you are exposed. And if you lose the brakes, as happened to Hamilton, you are helpless. The commissioners cannot understand the context from the pit wall, but the pilot does live it in their own flesh. Lewis faced that brutal dilemma. Either he left the track to cool the components and avoid a collision, or maintained his ideal drawing with the risk of ending against the wall. He decided to survive. But that decision, as we will see later, would be interpreted by the FIA as an infraction. This was the true backdrop of what was later simplified as multiple track exits. What for many was only a number on the penalty sheet was actually the result of a limit, technical and human situation, lived more than 300 kilometers per hour in one of the most hostile entertainment of Formula One calendar. The moment when the FIA announces a sanction is always loaded with tension. But there are times when this tension scales at unsustainable levels, not because of the magnitude of the punishment itself, but because of the implications it has within a more complex sports context. Lewis Hamilton's case in Singapore is one of those moments. A 5-second sanction may seem a minor punishment, but when the affected pilot is one of the most successful of all time, and when the circumstances are so particular, the matter becomes deeper than a simple penalty. The sanction is based, according to the official report of the sports commissioners, in multiple infractions committed by Hamilton between the 60s and 61. But what really does multiple infractions mean in the language of the FIA? In this case, it means having cut the curves 14 and 15 in Tour 60, and then having left track in curves 1, 2, 3, 7, 7 and again 14 in the next lap. It is not an isolated mistake. It is a repeated sequence that, in another context, could be interpreted as unsportsmanlike behavior or an attempt to obtain advantage. The problem is that this was not another context. Here we are not talking about a pilot looking for time back. We talk about a car with the brake system to the edge of the explosion, of a borderline situation that led one of the best pilots in the world to make survival decisions. And yet, the commissioners applied the regulation with the rigidity of a machine, without contemplating the exceptional conditions faced by Hamilton's car. This is not just about regulations, but the human interpretation of these regulations. Commissioners Gerd Enzer, Loic Backlane, Natalie Korsmit and Derek Warwick analyzed exhaustive evidence, telemetry, equipment radio, onboard recording and positioning data. In that review, it was clear that Hamilton did not try to deceive the system. He confirmed at the subsequent audience that his track departures were a desperate measure to avoid further forced brakes. A pragmatic decision, perhaps necessary to avoid an accident in a circuit where any error can mean a clash against the wall. But for the FIA, the regulation should be applied without nuances. His decision was based on the premise that the track departures, although justified from the technical point of view, were not contemplated within the exemptions provided for in Article 33.3 of the International Sports Code, nor on the guidelines on track limits of 2025. In other words, the regulation allows exceptions, but these must comply with a specific protocol that in this case, according to the official interpretation, was not fulfilled. It all started, silently, from lap 8. Brake system sensors already showed overheating alerts, especially on the left front disc. This is not a minor detail. Marina Bay layout requires a braking sequence at closed angles with little cooling time between sectors. Curve 7, for example, imposes a braking from more than 290 km per hour to just 60 km per hour, with a 50-meter margin to execute the maneuver. It is a ruthless test for any brake system, especially if the ventilation is not working 100%. Telemetry revealed that Hamilton began applying the lift and coast technique almost obsessively. This technique, normally used to save fuel or control temperatures, consists of lifting the throttle foot long before the usual braking point, allowing the car to reduce speed by inertia before stopping. However, in this case it was not a management strategy, it was survival. The objective was to minimize heat generation in the front brake system. As the race advanced, Hamilton's technical commitment increased. Each return was different from the previous one. The British constantly modified his braking references, tested more open lines, even sacrificed return time in order to keep the brakes below the critical threshold. But it was on Vuelta 60 when the system finally collapsed. The left front brake, the same one that had shown instability from the beginning, lost effectively in the braking of curve 16. Onboard images showed sparks leaving the drum, a clear sign that the friction material no longer existed or was totally degraded. This not only means loss of braking power, but also a brutal difference in the braking balance between the left and right axis, something that makes it almost impossible to control the car with precision in fast curves. That loss caused Hamilton to completely improvise his references in the following curves. Track outlets were not errors. They were the direct result of trying to stop a car that could no longer stop straight. Every time the steering wheel revolved and stepped on the brake, the car responded erratically, deriving to the escape without real possibility of maintaining the right layout. On lap 61, the data were even more alarming. Hamilton lost more than 32 seconds compared to its average rhythm. Fernando Alonso, who came to more than 45 seconds, reduced that difference to only 16 seconds in a turn. It was not a physical feinting or an erroneous strategy. It was a SF25 that had ceased to be competitive and entered into an emergency mode. Ferrari, from the wall, could not do much more than monitor. Changing the brake map, increasing cooling or modifying braking distribution was no longer possible without risking an accident or immediate withdrawal. The team decided to keep Hamilton on the track and seek to finish the race. The position at points was still possible, and abandoning would have meant a devastating blow to the morale of the team and for the pilot himself, which came from a season full of expectations and pressure. But there is a technical detail that made the difference: dirty air. Hamilton had been following Kimi Antonelli in turbulent air for several laps. This raised the temperature of the front brakes even more than normal. Not receiving clean air flow, cooling ducts worked at lower capacity, causing the discs to reach temperatures close to 1,200 degrees. At that temperature, carbon wear is exponential. The brakes stopped operating in their ideal parameters and entered into a critical risk zone. The consequence was not just a loss of performance. It was a total loss of dynamic control of the vehicle in braking. And that, in an urban circuit like Singapore, is a competitive death sentence. In summary, the collapse of the SF25 was not a sudden surprise, but a progressive phenomenon that Hamilton managed with a mastery for more than 50 laps. But when degradation exceeded the technical capacity of the car, there was no longer skill that could compensate for it. The most impressive thing is that, despite everything, the race ended. Not crashed, not out of points, simply sanctioned. What differentiates the Formula One from other sports is not just speed, technology, or history. It is the constant tension between the human and the regulatory. Motorsport is defined by a paradox. It is deeply mechanical, but it depends on human interpretation. And the case of the sanction to Lewis Hamilton in Singapore 2025 is a perfect mirror of that duality. What weighs more? The cold lyrics of the regulation or the exceptional circumstances that challenge it? From a purely normative point of view, the FIA acted within the legal framework. Traction infractions are contemplated in Article 33.3 of the International Sports Code, and the specific guidelines for 2025 reinforce the idea that repeated outputs without just cause must be sanctioned with a standard 5-second penalty. This regulation has a clear purpose: to prevent pilots from gaining unjustly leaving track. But there was no advantage here. What there was survival. When we analyze the case from a contextual perspective, the situation changes radically. Hamilton did not go out looking for time. He left because he had know how to stop. And that, in any other sport area, is considered mitigating. A player who slips for an injury does not receive a red card. A corridor that reduces the rhythm due to physical discomfort is not disqualified. But in the F1, where the regulation applies with an almost mathematical rigidity, the exceptions must be documented and justified in real time. And there is the problem. The loss of 7th position in Marina Bay means much more than a figure. It means losing rhythm in the direct battle with Mercedes, which has been reborn with George Russell and the debutant Kimi Antonelli. It means allowing McLaren to maintain the advantage he has built with his evolved aerodynamic package, and that Red Bull, although unstable with his second pilot, remains inside the reach with Max Verstappen winning points in each race. The competition does not forgive. And Ferrari knows it.do. You think Hamilton's sanction was fair? Or do you think that the FIA had to apply a more human, most contextual criterion? What would happen if the same situation happens to a pilot with less media weight? Would the decision have been the same? Are we seeing a change in the way in which the races are regulated, or simply one more sample that the regulation remains disconnected from reality on the track? I want to know what you think of all this.